morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear friends and partners. Welcome to the first webinar of the workshop series, Resume Sustainable Development Goal-Aligned South-South Investment Beyond COVID-19. My name is Xiaojun Grace Wang, Deputy Director of the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation. It's a pleasure for me to moderate the webinar today. Since the adoption of the SDGs, we see evident progress on investment in sustainable development sectors across sectors such as transport, infrastructure, climate change mitigation, food and agriculture, health, telecommunication, and ecosystems and diversity. However, we also see stagnant progress in investment in education, in water and sanitation. And overall, growth is falling well short of the requirements. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the challenge with steepest downturn of FDI by 42% worldwide last year. With only 10 years left to deliver the SDGs, with the alarming wake-up call brought by the pandemic, the world is urgently needing to look for solutions to resume and even accelerate its investment for SDGs. According to UNOSSC, if we look at SDG designated investing, the market is maybe about 1.2 to 1.3 trillion. However, if we look at aligning investment with SDGs to promote responsible investment, then the market is estimated to be at 29 trillion. The financing solution for accelerating development, accelerating SDGs would lie in how to reorient this kind of broad market to actually supporting sustainable development and be channeled to developing countries, especially LDCs, and to promote more and better investment. So in the coming 5 years, to recover from the pandemic, firms from the South will likely generate 1/3 of global foreign direct investment outflows, particularly those to manufacturing and service sector of other southern countries. Although capital market in emerging countries are in the early stages of the sustainability theme, there is strong demand and rising momentum in the SDG-aligned investment. The challenge is how to harmonize and innovate on policies, strategies, and tools, including ESG frameworks, how to ensure an inclusive process so that the world can leverage the largest potential and knowledge of the developing markets and deliver the impact at scale for sustainable development. In this context, the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation, in partnership with the Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, FCSSC, and the China International Center on Economic and Technical Exchange, CICETE, organizes this online workshop series under the framework of the Global South-South Development Center to enhance South-South cooperation and knowledge sharing in SDGs-aligned responsible investment for faster, greener, and more inclusive recovery from the pandemic. In today's webinar, we will focus on the global perspective and trend analysis of South-South investment and sustainable development. We have gathered very insightful and experienced policymakers and experts from different regions, different sectors, across governments, UN entities, international financial institutions, non-governmental organizations, and private sector. First of all, we will have the great honor to hear opening remarks by Mr. Cai Esheng, Chairman Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, and Mr. Zhang Yi, Deputy Director General of the China International Center for Economic and Technical Exchange, CICETE. Mr. Cai is chairman of the Finance Center for South-South Cooperation. Prior to leading this international NGO, Mr. Cai was elected as a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference too. In his speech today, Mr. Cai will shed light on recent trends on ESG investing in face of the new challenges and opportunities. Mr. Cai, it's a great pleasure to have you today. The floor is yours.
Affected by COVID-19, the global economy is greatly impacted, and ESG sustainable development has caught much attention of the whole world. Global ESG sustainable development market is rising against the trend. ESG sustainable development has caught the attention because it is aligned with the UN 2030 SDG goals. Now, the global ESG sustainable investment has the following trends. One, ESG sustainable investment is developing rapidly in the world. Institutional investors joined the UNPRI has a total asset under management of 103.4 trillion US dollars in 2020, a growth from 6.5 trillion US dollars in 2006. And secondly, the ESG sustainable development of developing countries and regions are at the initial stage, however, is increasing rapidly and shows great potential and room for development. In 2020, the number of institutions joining the UNPRI has increased 40% in South Europe, 80% in CEE and CIS, and 77% in China. More and more institutions in developing countries and regions are willing to join this principle. However, we can still see a great gap between developing countries and developed countries in ESG development. And thirdly, government and regulators in southern countries are promoting ESG development, integrating it into national development, and align it with the market standards. Brazil National Monetary Council has issued policies on social and environmental responsibilities. And the Chinese government also announced the 30 and 60 goals of emission peaking and carbon neutrality goals to promote quality development. And fourthly, AI and digital development has upgraded the quality of ESG investment and are giving greater roles to data and ESG standards to play important roles. Digital application can help facilitate the sustained practices and AI can be used to assess supply chain impacts, corporate environment information disclosure, employment relations, and the social responsibility and the shareholding responsibility. Now, ESG sustainable development is a widely accepted idea. However, it's still faced with challenges. In the global aspect of the major challenge is that the assessment systems are not unified and there is a lack of information disclosure. The assessment systems and measurements among different ESG assessment institutions are different, and the judgment and assessment are sometimes subjective and lacks transparency. And in terms of developing countries, southern countries still lack a sound ecosystem for ESG development, and the awareness is insufficient, and there are deficiencies in practices, information disclosure and regulation systems, and human resources, etc. Given the trend of the investment and its potentials and challenges, and to promote ESG development, especially in southern countries, we can focus on the following aspects. One, we need to complete the standard and assessment system, taking into consideration the participators in developing countries and all the stakeholders to form consensus driven by the market and form viable systems for evaluation. And we can also build a framework, guiding framework by different sectors. And secondly, we need to build and improve the investment ecosystem. Governments and regulators need to play a leading role to create a sound environment for the investment. And thirdly, we need to increase the communication and cooperation between developing countries and developed countries. Developing countries need to draw experience from the information disclosure frameworks set by international authoritative institutions so that they can be aligned with the global market. And fourthly, developing countries need to build their capacities and build supporting and incentive mechanism for companies and institutional investors and build a global network. Ladies and dear friends, FCSSC has been promoting global sustainable development in recent years. We pay attention to ESG and impact investment. We participated and supported the Impact Investment Fund established by UNDP, organizing experts for studies on the trend of investment and China impact investment cases. By the end of the year, we're going to publish the report of the research and studies. FCSSC is willing to work with all parties to promote the practices and development of sustainable investment focusing on ESG in developing countries. I wish this workshop a full success, and we're going to have more this kind of workshops. I'm looking forward to your participation.
谢谢蔡主席. Thank you very much. Now I have the honor to invite Mr. Zhang Yi, Deputy Director General of CICETE, to give us opening remarks. Mr. Zhang, leading an organization, CICETE, which is a very important partner of UN Office for South-South Cooperation. In his role, Mr. Zhang oversees the work related to bilateral and multilateral UN development programs in China, South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund portfolio, foreign assistance talent development projects, exhibition and training programs undertaken by the Ministry of Commerce. Many of those areas was related to what the recommendation was just put forward by Mr. Cai. Before joining CICETE, Mr. Zhang worked as Director of Africa Division of Department of Foreign Assistance as MOFCOM and held several important positions in China's embassy in Pakistan, Liberia, Dubai, and South Sudan, very familiar with the situation in the global South. So, Mr. Zhang, it's an honor to have you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Director Xiaojun, Chairman Cai, dear colleagues, guests. Good morning, good evening, good night. It's a great pleasure of mine to be a part of this online event. First of all, I'm very honored to extend my warmest congratulations to the commencement of this series of events on behalf of CICETE and extend our heartfelt appreciation and thanks to the thorough preparation you have made to both Chinese and foreign teams. The concept of sustainable development came into conception along with the fast development after the Industrial Revolution, which caused a crisis on society and environment. In 1987, the World Environment and Development Committee released a report called Our Common Future, and that has proposed the most widely known definition for sustainable development, which that it could both fulfill the needs of the contemporaries while not endangering the development of the capacity for future generations. Sustainable development requires the balance between the three pillars: economic development, social inclusion, and ecological protection, so that we could realize the balance between the needs and the limitations. In 2015, 190 members of the UN reached a consensus for the 2030 SDGs. And after that, all countries are actively participating and facilitating the implementation and realization of SDGs. Frankly speaking, the results are not yet satisfactory. The Secretary General of UN, Guterres, said in the 10-year action plan for SDGs, saying that the SDGs are now facing with severe challenges and risks. The implementation schedule of 2030 SDGs is well behind our planning and requires more financial support. Last year, the unexpected COVID-19 pandemic aggravated this challenge. Developing countries, every year, they're having a funding gap of more than trillions of dollars. In the past few decades, the trade and investment on South-South cooperation is on the rise. In the face of the pandemic, South-South trade demonstrated strong resilience. It can be seen that South cooperation and South nations are now taking a more important role in global economic development, but developed countries are still the most important part and important source for the funding the international development cooperation. Trilateral cooperation could bridge the gap the South or underdeveloped countries are facing in terms of their shortage in fund management and technology. We hold great promise in terms of investment for trilateral cooperation. The global financial markets are now finding new areas and opportunities for investment. In recent years, under the concept of investment and capital for the good, more and more investors are focusing on the combination of the environmental and social effect with business profit, and their influential power is on the rise. Many of their explorations achieved initial results. For example, green bonds is a very successful, sustainable financial innovative model in the realm of environment, and that has provided insights and experiences for the funding in other SDGs. 2021 is the inception year of the 14th Five-Year Plan of China. In the government working report promoted by the two sessions, it says that China will support the low-carbon development policy, and we will provide a supporting instrument for carbon emission so that we will make our due contribution to the coping of climate change. Green finance is important support for the carbon peaking and carbon neutralization. We will have a coordinated development between governments, industrial organizations, enterprises, and research institutions so that we could form a benevolent cycle. Today, green development and digital economy is an important way out for us to cope with the challenges for new development, but that is not all. Sustainable development is a systemic project that has an overall impact. We need a multidimensional scientific coordinated development and high-quality development, which means that we will fulfill the demand of our people for a better life. This kind of development should embody the concept of new development. This is the driver for innovation, so that we could make coordination its endogenous characteristics, while greenness being its universal form. CICETE, as a dedicated specialized management institution for international development cooperation, we have always dedicated ourselves for the deepening of cooperation with United Nations and we are making effective cooperation in terms of attracting investment, technology facilitation, innovation, and regional economic integrated governance, poverty alleviation, and countryside revitalization. For 38 years, we have implemented and participated more than 1,000 projects launched by the United Nations in China, covering every aspect and areas in economic and social development. In recent years, under the background of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, in order to accelerate the upgrade of industries, we deepened our cooperation with UNIDO and have set up investment and technology facilitation office in Beijing and Shanghai, making China the only country that hosting 2 offices. And we also launched many of the ESG development projects with architectural industries. We're also setting up hydrogen projects, supporting the implementation of the Industrial Park International Guidance for South-South Industrial Cooperation Center. Under the new circumstances, we're also working with UNDP so that we could set up a project that will facilitate the influence of SDGs so that we could push for the localization of SDGs. We're also working with some local governments to discuss about the possibilities in launching a pilot zone or an exemplary projects for SDGs financing. And we're also talking about the feasibility in setting up an UNDP Global Sustainable Development Financing Policy Center. My co-workers are working with local government officials, and they will also share their details in terms of practice, both on macro and local level. The Global South-South Development Center project is now undertaking the analysis of the Chinese enterprises' facilitation of their ESGs in Africa. All of those will be beneficial for South-South cooperation and for the resumption of investment and cooperation among underdeveloped nations. My dear friends, spring is the right time for us to strive. Let us take this event as an opportunity to pull consensus for the resumption of sustainable investment and South-South cooperation and contribute more wisdom and strength for South-South cooperation and global sustainable development. We hope this pandemic will soon be a thing of the past so that we could have more face-to-face and in-depth communication and cooperation. And now, I wish this meeting a great success. Thank you.
谢谢张主任。Thank you very much, Mr. Zhang, for your opening remarks. Very informative and inspiring. Actually, the upcoming initiatives is very important for us to follow up this dialogue, but also put in very practical cooperation with our partners together. Thank you. Now, with the opening remarks, let's open the session for presentations and discussion. The first speaker we have is Mr. Samuel Manzel Maimopo, Director of International Development Association, IDA, Resource Mobilization and International Bank for Reconstruction and Development Corporate Finance Department, or bank. Mr. Mambo is the director, and in his role, he's responsible for the implementation of the World Bank's IDA's hybrid financial model and policy analysis of IBRD, income and corporate finance. So Mr. Mambo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my presentation. Good morning, good evening. Thank you very much for this invitation to this important discussion. I am very pleased to share our thoughts at the World Bank on South-to-South cooperation. But given the excellent introductory remarks that we've had, I think it would be beneficial if I spend a little bit of time explaining exactly why this is important. And in doing so, what I'd like to do is to remind ourselves of the global architecture as it stands today and why South-to-South cooperation in a post-COVID environment has to address the issues of financing, international cooperation, as well as the substance of the reforms themselves. So if I can start with a very simple diagram of where the World Bank, how the World Bank is organized. I am part of the IDA group. And one thing to remember about this group is that not only do we provide grants, but we actually go to the market to raise money and for on lending to emerging economies. This is particularly important because over the last 60 years that IDA has been in operation, we have increased the level of financing from the market and from our own balance sheet by as much as 70%. So as we stand, about 30% of our financing comes from grants. The rest is financed from our own balance sheet as well as going onto the market. And therefore, we are particularly interested to make sure that any market impacts on our lending is managed well for the benefit of our membership. Now, when it comes to thinking about the role of institutions like ours and as well as middle income countries and emerging donors in development, there are a number of things that I think are especially important. And in going through these key elements, it's useful to remind ourselves that the World Bank, like other MDBs, are really cooperative models, which are part and parcel or which are composed of both developed and developing countries. And developing countries account for nearly half of our shareholding and voting power. This is particularly important because when it comes to the second element, the facilitation of knowledge between middle-income countries and lower-income countries, this is really a strong feature of our institutional role. It's not just the financing. In fact, increasingly, this knowledge element takes greater prominence than the financing itself. And as part of this financing angle, we make sure that we leverage the financial resources of all of the cooperatives' membership. And in fact, many of the emerging donors are not our traditional donors in terms of increasing the level of financing that we see going into development, which is why I'll also spend a bit of time talking about the private sector window and the role that it plays in South-to-South private sector investments. Just to give you a simple example, the World Bank, when we talk about it being a global bank, we view it primarily as a global institution sharing knowledge. We will see, this graph demonstrates how a small experiment that started in Brazil and in Mexico in 1997 quickly grew to being successfully implemented in 64 low-income countries by 2016. These are the type of initiatives that we are going back to and thinking carefully as we look at the impact that COVID has had. And in doing so, there are numerous examples all across the world where the institution, working with a lot of partners around the world, have been able to curate thought leadership, have been able to share knowledge across different income group levels and countries. From this slide, you can see many examples of how we facilitate this knowledge. For example, we helped Ethiopia learn from China's experience in planning expressways. There are lots of examples that I could have used on this slide, but just to make sure that you can see some of these examples, we limited the number. But we are very proud of these transfers of knowledge. Increasingly, we find that when countries share knowledge amongst themselves, they're certainly much more efficient, much more effective than when we try to do it out of the headquarters of Washington, DC. I'd like to spend a bit of time highlighting the financing role. One of the points that were made, both by our eloquent opening remarks, is the mere acknowledgement that the SDGs require a substantial amount of financial resources. And in doing so, we have continued to encourage new members of the non-Paris Club members to substantially increase their contributions to global development. And we're very proud of the fact that today China is now a major lender in sub-Saharan Africa, well ahead of the World Bank Group. The World Bank operates mostly in the official loan space, but as you can see, a large portion of IDA financing is provided in grants, mostly in countries with high risk of debt distress. Now, this particular graph shows you that with our financing model over 3 replenishment cycles, and these replenishment cycles are typically 3-year cycles, we can see that emerging donors are also increasingly supporting multilateral lending institutions, including IDA. And our hybrid model, as I mentioned earlier, then allows us to leverage this financing through the private market as much as 4 times. We're very glad to observe the increasing share of emerging donors. In particular, donors in the East Asia Pacific region have multiplied their IDA contributions by 3 in IDA 19 compared to IDA 17. I'd also like to take the opportunity to mention with a great deal of thanks that China has now become the 6th largest donor to IDA 19. A few words on the private sector window, because this is where we leverage and pull in private sector financing, especially in those countries or those regions that are fragile or conflict affected. The window has been instrumental in supporting our work since it was established in IDA 19 with a total amount of about 2.5 billion and now operates across 4 different facilities. This has proved to be a powerful instrument because with every dollar that we invest through this window, we're able to attract $5.5 in private sector investment. This is working very closely with the IFC and MEGA. And quite recently, we established a working capital solution for COVID-19 facility under which the IFC can provide working capital loans to financial institutions and to banks to on-lend to SMEs in multiple countries that are eligible for private sector financing. This is an important element of our South-to-South investment strategy. And here are some of very simple examples of how we have managed to do this in a number of different sectors. While I only mention 2 investments here, I certainly find that we certainly find that the types of investment we've been able to attract not only are providing financing opportunities for global investors, but local investors are participating too. One of the benefits of working with a multilateral institution between 2 South-to-South investors is to ensure additionality, to ensure adequate amount of concessionality, to avoid market distortion, and to apply high ESG standards whenever we can. Now, let me in giving you this background, I wanted to really emphasize the fact that as much as COVID has challenged all of us, the basic foundational structures for us to cooperate to respond are already in place. Much of the work that you have highlighted in your opening remarks, a lot of the research that you have mentioned goes directly into influencing how global policy is designed, how projects are invested. And this has really helped us make sure that our own response to COVID has been strong. And one of the reasons we are very concerned at this particular time is that the economic recession in IDA countries is the worst in 4 decades, with growth projected to fall to its lowest level in more than a generation, and an additional 88 to 144 million people on the verge of falling back into extreme poverty, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Growth decline is reversing years of progress that many of us here have put towards longer-term achievement of the SDGs. The baseline projections suggest that global poverty rates will rise significantly in 2020 and will stay above pre-crisis levels in 2021. For that reason, the bank's response, working together with a number of countries across the globe, has been strong and has been ambitious. This is a simple slide that shows you the amount of resources that are being deployed to help strengthen national systems for public health, to finance either countries seeking to acquire vaccines. And so far, IDA has delivered approximately 38 billion in the last 12 months, half of which is for the COVID crisis response. Overall, we expect that in IDA 19, our commitments are expected to be about 35 billion in FY21. That's the period July 2020 to July 2021. And so as we pivot to the future, and as we discuss, and as many of you will continue to explain throughout the remainder of this workshop, as we pivot forwards, the support that we must provide countries revolves around three objectives. Number one, we need to save lives and protect the poor from the pandemic. Not only this one, but the one that is going to come in future. Second, we need to secure the foundations of the economies as necessary for future recovery. Without supporting the economies, we will not be able to sustain a long-term recovery. Third, we need to strengthen policies and institutions for resilience to make sure that when the next pandemic hits, we are better able to support our countries and they're able to respond themselves. Now, let me leave you with a few thoughts of where we go from here. Certainly from the World Bank's perspective, the crisis has been of such magnitude that we have shortened the traditional IDA cycle from 3 years to 2 years. We will spend the rest of the year trying to attract additional financing so that in the next year, we're able to lend as much as 35 billion to IDA countries. Much of this, we would very much like to see financing South-to-South investments and support over the next number of years. It is the only way in which we deal with the high levels of the gap in policy commitments. We deal with the large debt issues that surround the world, and also make sure that we're able to elevate the many people who have fallen back into poverty going forward. Our work at the bank will focus on three key elements: making sure that any investments are green, that we are supporting our work in agriculture and infrastructure in an environmentally sustainable manner. Second, that we focus on resilience, really building and strengthening the shock absorbing systems that impact people whenever there's a crisis, especially in areas of health and education. And thirdly, we're going to focus on making sure that this work is inclusive. It has to be equitable. Unless we deal with the increasing inequality gaps around the world, the types of challenges that we face will continue to increase. So the work that we're going to do on social protection programs, on gender, on disability, and on FCV states will continue to increase with time. So with these few words, I do want to stress that how pleased we are to be participating in this conversation. IDA certainly sees itself as a platform. It's a global platform open to its members to continue to provide the type of global leadership forum for an exchange of ideas or financing that convenes a global community, both North and South, as well as South to South. We see this as essential for us to build back better in a world that has been hit by a significant crisis. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for this opportunity and look forward to the presentations that you have lined up for this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Can I call you that?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting the urgency of investment for SDGs and for providing such a platform through IDA to convene communities and sharing knowledge, building capacities. We look forward to work even further with you and to hear more from your insights later. Now, let me welcome our second speaker, Ms. Kauri Singhia. Ms. Kauri Singhia is now a senior specialist focusing on sustainable development goals at the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI. Before that, Kauri worked on corporate finance transactions at international law firms, including Norton Rose and Linklaters in Moscow, Prague, London, and Tokyo. She also worked for consulting firms, including Lehman Brothers and Nomura, and served as financial sector policy advisor at Oxfam. Ms. Curry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen now for the presentation. As Grace explained, I work at the UNPRI, specializing on the SDGs. Just very quickly, the PRI principles were launched in April 2006 by the late UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan. It is an investor-led initiative to put 6 principles for investment into practice. And the 6 principles you can see on the slide there. And next, I wanted to show how the responsible investment policy has been developing globally. So the number of responsible investment policy and regulations have been increasing dramatically, especially in the last few years. And in 2020 alone, over 120 new or revised policy instruments were established. It's been the highest number ever and 30% more than in 2019. This growth is reassuring sign that even in times of crisis, regulators are not taking responsible investment off the agenda. Increasingly, they understand the crucial role it plays in our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are some of the reasons why responsible policies are on the rise. This is because sustainable finance and investment can support national policy goals on climate change and sustainable development goals, enhance economic resilience and stability, improve market efficiency, and also increase countries' attractiveness as investment destinations. In order to help regulators to implement responsible investment policies, the PRI and the World Bank have developed a policy toolkit for regulators on how to design and implement financial policy frameworks aligning capital markets with sustainable growth. Moving on to investing with SDG outcomes. As you can see from this graph, the interest in SDGs by investors have been growing. Over 600 of PRI's reporting signatories mentioned that they have some investment activities focused on the SDGs, which represents over 30% of our reporting signatories, and this has been increasing. SDGs represent a shift in perspective from what do external factors like the ENS factors, environmental social factors, affect my portfolio, to how does my portfolio affect the external world. And these are related because of the feedback loop. There is a continuous feedback cycle between ESG risks and opportunities and SDG-aligned outcomes. ESG issues create risks and opportunities for investors whose actions shape outcomes on the real world, which feed back into portfolios in the form of ESG risks and opportunities. For example, investments that increase health outcomes lead to healthy workforce and better economic growth, which in turn lead to better portfolio performance. Conversely, investments that exacerbate inequalities will increase social unrest and uncertainty, which can lead to increased volatility in portfolio performance. Therefore, our view is that in order to support meeting the SDGs, investors must understand how they can increase the positive outcomes and decrease the negative outcomes arising from their actions. In order to help investors implement this implement and contribute to the SDGs, last year, PRI published a 5-part framework for investors that are seeking to understand the real-world outcomes of their investments. The first part involves identifying positive and negative real-world outcomes related to investees' operations, products, and services. Part 2 sees investors setting policies and targets to increase positive and decrease negative outcomes. In Part 3, investors shape those outcomes in line with the policies and targets that they set and report on the progress against those objectives. Part 4 is in recognition that one investor alone cannot achieve the SDGs. Investors need to act with other financial sector players, such as credit rating agencies, index providers, proxy advisors, banks, insurers, and multilateral financial institutions. And lastly, Part 5 recognizes the fact that financial sector alone cannot achieve the SDGs. So financial sector need to work with other businesses, governments, academia, civil society, the media, individuals, and their communities to collectively achieve the SDGs. For practical examples on how investors are having real-world impact and implementing this framework, we have collected some case studies which you can find on our website.
Thank you very much, Kari, for introducing the PRI and also for actually sharing with us your ongoing work. Now, let me move forward to invite Dr. Hani Basada, Senior Research and Program Advisor from UNOSSC for South-South Cooperation. Dr. Hani is also a Senior Research Fellow at the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa, University of Toronto, Columbia University, China Agricultural University, Carleton University. Dr. Hani, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be here with you and give this short presentation. Prospective investment. Essentially, the environmental criteria look at how an organization behaves as a steward of the environment. Social criteria look at how it engages with staff, investors, clients, and cultures it works with. The leadership of a corporation, executive compensation, audits, internal controls, and shareholder interest, all covered by governance. ESG investment is a pillar of sustainable development for the Global South. Long-term value generation for businesses and society is the aim of ESG-based investment decisions. As a result, it has a clear link to the SDGs idea of creating shared value, which reflects a positive convergence of consumer opportunity, society and social needs, and policy action for long-term inclusive approach to economic development and well-being. ESG-aligned investments have expanded in volume, scope, and scale over the last decade. In 2019, green bond issuance totaled $257 billion, up 50% from the previous year. Although issuance has declined in 2020, markets have seen a spike in social and COVID-19 themed bonds, which have totaled $65 billion so far this year. According to UNCTAD, the overall amount of sustainability-oriented bonds and funds in the world is now put between 1.2 and 1.3 trillion. The UN's Principles for Responsible Investment Initiative has developed into a thriving network of nearly 3,000 organizations, institutions around the world involved in responsible investment since its inception 15 years ago. Current figures clearly evidence the effectiveness of investing centered around SDGs considerations. According to data from indexing firm, the MSCI Emerging Markets ESG Leaders Index, which measures firms with high ESG output compared to their peers, outperformed the larger MSCI Emerging Markets Index by 14.5% annualized return against 10.7%. In terms of ESG investing in the Global South, historically, the majority of emerging market economies, such as the BRIC, have followed in the footsteps of established markets by focusing on carbon-based energy sources, such as oil, coal, to boost economic growth. The concern is that such development is no longer considered sustainable due to the environment damage caused by fossil fuels. Since many Southern countries lack the means to cope with certain challenges, avoiding potential crises is important. Many economies, such as Mexico, are utilizing green finance to foster long-term economic development, such as the renewable energy facilities for Mexico City International Airport. For the last 2 years, the demand of these green securities have exploded. According to data from the Climate Bonds Initiative, 320 issuers sold green bonds worth $167 billion in 2018, up from less than $50 billion in 2015. Other policymakers are confronting the issue of climate change head-on, include China, which has been very constructive in this regard. It launched the idea of the ecological civilization in 2007, and it now plays a key role in the global development policy. In Africa, measures such as the South African Carbon Tax Act number 15 are shifting the fundamental economics to support carbon-efficient technology in all sectors of nature. Low-carbon solutions such as the SP South Africa DSW Capped Carbon Efficient Index could be preferred by investors seeking to protect themselves against rising costs of carbon-intensive portfolio. In Asia, according to the new MSCI 2021 Global Institutional Investor Study, 79% of investors in Asia Pacific increased ESG investments significantly or moderately in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As such, ESG-focused investment policy are clearly becoming a central part of investment attraction across Southern regions. As part of ESG investing, social impact investing can not only continue to steer new financial flows in developing countries, they can also improve investment efficiency, competitiveness, transparency, and size, resulting in greater economic and social gains for the world's poor. For example, a UNDP study demonstrates money flows from the private sector and philanthropic players are creating resources for impact donors to extend access to critical services such as healthcare, education, clean water, and electricity in Africa. This context of investing allows for private sector to combine market momentum for innovation, for efficiently leveraging sustainable investment opportunities. Renewable energy, agriculture, growth, and health are examples of areas where social impact investment experiences difficulty in attracting other types of private investment. Many of these issues and techniques overlap with companies' mandatory reporting standard, as defined in the SDGs. Such platforms becomes mechanism for Southern public and private investors to refer to for better understanding and achieving sustainability targets without losing out on capital gains. In terms of capital building, capacity building, and ESG investing, there's a critical lesson in understanding the varying political economic conditions that diversify ESG investment factors and challenges by region. The Global South is certain to face challenges different from the North. This is true in the context of differences across and within regions, and how willing and able investment firms are to address ESG issues in investing. A 2015 survey by CFA Institute found that Northern economies, particularly North America, are the least likely to issue ESG information in terms of decision-making process, with only 59% considering ESG issues. Contrastingly, however, there are a relatively high proportion of survey respondents in Asia Pacific region consider ESG issues, around 78%, followed closely by members of the MENA region, around 74%. This reflects that despite the lack of capabilities across Southern economies to implement ESG investment policies, there's a greater level of willingness and thus an opportunity for improvement. Moreover, more preparation and training are needed for those who consider ESG concerns when investing. Furthermore, the main emerging trend among institutional investors today is to integrate ESG factors across all asset classes. This includes ESG information, credit appraisal conducted by investors, and internal due diligence procedures. Engagement and dialogue with emerging market issues will become a prevalent theme in emerging markets investment if this logic is followed. Investors are showing a growing interest in engaging policymakers in their contribution to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, as well as evaluating governance and structure capabilities. As governance is a large part in facilitating ESG investment, there is a need to ensure that the governments and the respective departments are clearly equipped with the capacity to bring in, accommodate, and sustain this investment. As such, Southern economies must strengthen and scale up capabilities across all sectors to best respond to investor requests for ESG investment pathways. Vague ESG criteria and definitions have long presented challenges to the validity and risk associated with ESG framework. On the other hand, market barriers in Southern economies have detracted ESG flows. Regulatory policies and weak domestic markets present a great challenge to ESG investment attraction. In terms of aligning the post-COVID-19 recovery agenda with the SDGs, global FDI flows are forecast to contract by 30 to 40% in 2021, according to UNCTAD, which is going to have significant consequences for a sustainable recovery post-COVID-19 era. Another aspect of ESG investment to be addressed for a sustainable recovery agenda is the misunderstanding that failure to make investment more sustainable has no corporate or fiduciary jurisdiction. Without sacrificing capital, countries should emphasize the fight against climate change and other socially environmental conscious issues in this investment. A 2020 study examining the significance of ESG investing to sovereign wealth funds and pension funds across Latin America found that during the coronavirus outbreak, ESG investments outperformed conventional indexes. This reason perhaps being that companies that emphasize environmental and social and corporate governance considerations are more seasoned and well managed and therefore better navigate through economic crisis. In conclusion, overall integrity of ESG investment efficiency in investment decisions is not a culture phenomenon. It's part of a wider redefining of a company's position in which stakeholder capital maximization is no longer the prime goal. It's gaining momentum in many parts of the global south. It may be critical in solving some of the many issues that threaten many countries, such as over-reliance on fossil fuels, the shortage of renewable energy production. Over the next few years, development agencies, multilateral development banks, development finance organizations, and foundations will play a crucial and important role in fostering the project pipeline in the poorest and most insecure countries while maintaining high ESG levels. Thank you very much.
Now, our next speaker, I have the honor to introduce Mr. Kenneth Honor Renner, Legal, Regulatory, and Investment Principal at BCAR International. Kenneth is currently the principal on legal, regulatory, and investment issues. He is also a commercial, finance, and corporate lawyer, a specialist in hybrid capital structures, venture capital, and private equity. He has extensive legal and regulatory experiences that have included roles in private sector, as well as in-house counsel to large corporations. So, Kenneth, we look forward to hear from you perspectives and experiences from private sector.
My approach is much more pragmatic and more hands-on as a practitioner. So I tend to have to fix the problems when the transaction has gone wrong. And I've often asked why don't we take a more proactive role in the multilateral agencies and the financing organizations, private equity or venture capital, especially in emerging and frontier markets. So for instance, the country that I specialize in, which is in Qatar and the Middle East, they have a goal to go into South-South transactions, but they're always very reluctant to do so because of the risks and the real perception and the real situation that has happened where investments have not gone the way they ought to. So today I'm going to look at the legal and regulatory trends in terms of the environmental and social government investment and investing. And they come in 4 or 5 bubbles that I've identified from when I prepared for this. We have to consider the legal, the regulatory, the trends where we're going, the environmental, and of course, the investing framework as we are. Now, we will explore the strategies and frameworks that encourages and retains ESG investing for sustainable government goals in a concise and robust manner so that we can get the best possible outcomes. This framework looks at the past, the present, and the future, which I will share with you now across the Global South. And so how are we going to do this? In the past, I was speaking to a colleague and I was explaining to him how, from a litigation perspective, often investments have not worked very well simply because of the perception that they were going to face litigation in a serious manner. A good example that has just changed recently has been the situation in Nigeria, where Shell has now been found by the English courts that they do have a liability. But I'll expand on that later. So that's what's happening in the present. Now, what I'm going to suggest in the future, in which the director at the very start of the presentation suggested was what we should do is to bring in new technology to be able to bridge these anomalies in the transaction space so that we could effectively get what we want to do and guarantee our transactions. We are going to look at the policy trends as well as the background to litigation trends, legislation, and legal frameworks. What has happened is the governments in the Global South tend to be resource constrained, as well as the private sector tends to be risk averse. So you have these two situations that are working against the lubricated and the free flow of investment, which means that there's risk of litigation. There are real situations that transactions that are not going to, that ordinarily should have happened, don't happen simply because of these situations that we have. They often fail to launch or reach full potential due to systemic failures and the dearth of capital. Governments in the Global South often lack technical capacity and often allow risk-laden projects to go ahead due to shortcomings in their ESG policy, legislative enforcement, and frameworks. Similarly, legal risks for corporates and their investors are often in the mix of said investments, and projects are exposed, and there are clear and elevating risks in the Global South investment sphere every day. Now, in certain jurisdictions, we find in the Global South, governments are often failing to adhere to their obligations simply because they lack the legislative and implementation capacity, both at the public and civil service level. The private sector also has the same problem. We have to help them ensure that projects are bankable and sustainable, and that there's a clear need for institutional confidence from governments and the Global South to encourage investors. Companies across the Global South are very keen to invest. In this case, what I've seen with the institutional investors, especially sovereign wealth funds in the GCC, in Qatar, especially, are acutely weathered due to an uptick in geopolitical tensions driven by COVID-19 in 2020, and for instance in the Black Lives Matter movement. 2021 has now started to see new variants of COVID-19. So that means that the risk has not gone away, and there's a continued despite there being a continued focus on long-term sustainable growth. There's a symbiosis between the impact of companies on the social and environmental trends, as well as the impact of the environmental and social trends on companies. Both of them are interlinked in terms of dealing with the risks that are often perceived that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I talked about the new developments that have happened. This morning I was on a conference call with some colleagues of mine in Doha, and they are in the middle of an energy initiative. And energy, as you know, comes with a lot of opportunity, but it's risk laden. So in this situation here, they want to invest across the global south, and we're encouraging them to do so. But it doesn't help when we get a judgment from the courts in England in 2021, February this year, to say that the mistakes of a major energy company, Shell, can now be sued in the English courts. 10 years ago, this was not the case. We had the same matter brought up in New York under the Foreign Torts Act, and it was struck down to say that individuals cannot sue corporations. And we thought that that was the end of it. The door was shut. So going forward, if sustainable development goals are to be achieved, we have to make sure that there are clear regulatory, legal structures that are traceable, enforceable, and doable and implementable across governments and across multilateral agencies. Otherwise, the risk that I mentioned will continue, and this particular risk that has now come to the fore will come back and impact the investment ecosystem. So how do we get around this? We've got to look for solutions to address the issues, and we have to consider strategies for implementation. The solutions to address the issues include smart contracting, artificial intelligence, as well as smart investment verification systems, which means that the counterparty situation that is often the blockage in letting transactions happen no longer is a problem. Now, when we go for implementation, our South-South partners have to understand that there must be government policy in place, that we have taken a very clear and unequivocal approach to make sure that everybody knows that government is going to support it. So there must be stated government policy, there must be a green paper, there must be a white paper, draft legislation, and an act of parliament. And all of this can be put together in a smart framework that we can go from one government or one agency to another and help them get past their capacity constraints. So, the smart contracting and investment framework, which I mentioned earlier, need to be recognized by local laws. They're bolt on and ring fenced with legislation. They provide comfort and assurance to foreign direct investment, commercial and multilateral financing parties, and that includes emerging investors. As I've mentioned to you, the government implementation plan should be the following: stated government policy. My friends here at UNOSSC have the access to be able to encourage and get our governments in the South to see the benefits of moving to this level of implementation, where we go from government policy, green paper, white paper, draft legislation, and acts of parliament in a relatively quick and short space of time. One of the things that we must do also is to make sure that all investments are bankable and sustainable, and that strategic sovereign assets are not used as collateral for investments. What do I mean by this? At the very start, I talked about the whole activism that is going on in the world today. And if a group of people feel that their rights or their futures are being mortgaged, then invariably there may be some activism which will not make the projects viable. So I think there must be a collective understanding to say, yes, we want to invest. Yes, we want to utilize the receivables, the profits from those particular projects that are going to come out of them. But the actual strategic sovereign assets shouldn't be used as collateral to investments, simply because it just means that the risk of activism and project failure is increased by factors unseen. The legislative model that I've spoken about earlier must be one that is clearly allows for bankable projects to be financed within the framework, and effectively this gives the confidence that everybody is on board with this. Now, when you do get this, there are going to be disputes. So also bolted onto this, from an implementation and practical perspective, I believe that there must be independent investment dispute tribunals. Sorry? Independent investment dispute tribunals, which effectively will deal with dispute resolution mechanisms, and the Act of Parliament is ring-fenced and enforceable for these investments that go south. I mentioned the strategic sovereign assets. These include all of these: power plants, shipping ports, and the like, so that we know that the investor and the investment community, as well as the multilateral agencies, are able to go in, that they know that the risk profile has reduced substantially because of the approaches that I'm suggesting here. One of the spin-offs from this is, which we do in the sovereign wealth funds, is to create investment protection schemes, which can go into country and effectively invigorate a sleeping insurance industry. But that's just a side issue there, which we have done, and it has worked quite well. So what are the outcomes? I believe that for us to be able to have sustainable development goals within the ESG framework, whatever we do in terms of the legislative, risk mitigation, and investments that we do, they must be transparent, enforceable, comprehensive. And the regulatory framework must invite and retain foreign investment from both commercial and multilateral financing parties, not forgetting our friends from the emerging investors. And all of this can be put together in a treaty, so that we can start to say, as they say in Africa, Ubuntu, I exist because you exist. So if we work together to have an equitable distribution, equitable investment frameworks, then we won't get the activism, we won't get the litigation, we won't have to worry about investments going south, simply because we hadn't thought it through at the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for the presentation and for your very important recommendations. In particular, I heard so clearly your recommendation for international organizations like our office to support, connect the stakeholders to make the positive changes on legislative frameworks happen faster and involving all stakeholders as necessary to jointly own the framework and to jointly push forward the changes. Thank you very much. And we will definitely study this recommendation very carefully and look into more exchanges with you on this insight. Thank you. Now let me welcome our next speaker, Dr. Maman Sani Issa, Director, Environmental and Social Safeguards and Compliance Department, Africa Development Bank. Dr. Issa has over 25 years of diverse and extensive experiences in global and local environment and managerial issues. So Dr. Issa, we look forward to hear from you. This floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you for inviting me to this very, very important session. And, you know, to allow me giving some insight or perspective from Africa, which is one of the most important factors when it comes to South-South cooperation. Environmental information disclosure is something that is at the core of what we are here calling ESG, ENS governance. But let me start by just mentioning that ENS information, which includes many, many aspects and variables like data, activities, climate change risk, information, and overall ENS and performance of entities. As said by my predecessor, this information remains as one of the critical piece to achieving sustainable development because of multiple use that development actors do with this type of information. Overall, I would say ENS information is critical for investment first, to assess development results and its inclusiveness. Sorry. So I will skip this slide because, again, my predecessor have already mentioned the current trends related to how ESG is impacting the global market and investment environment. But just to mention that this figure will give you a bit of flavor of how ESG, when considered, is highly positive for development, institutions, business. As I said, I will skip quickly because it is not necessary anymore to mention how ESG or ESI is key for investment or development or business. So let me focus on the ENS information disclosure as it is practiced currently by DFI and MDBs like the African Development Bank. We have key principles when it comes to ENS information sharing, and this is something that is common almost to all these MDBs, as I was saying. There is a broad definition and inclusive one of who deserve to receive information, what we call stakeholders, because our information disclosure policies are targeting the global audience, which is financiers, constituencies, countries, government, all these people that are largely, concerned by development effectiveness And the second pillar, second principle of these policies, I would say these policies, they are common, but each institution has its own policy. The right to information is something that is well captured in the principle of our institution when it comes to information disclosure, and the principle of almost no restriction, which is that all available information that we have, data, statistics, reports, all kind of information that is available must be disclosed to the public. The objective being to ensure that appropriate, and the word appropriate is very important here. I will come back to that later. Appropriate information on ENS risk and impact for decision making is available for the stakeholder in understandable and usable format. Then, some key principle. One example that I wanted to consider here is my own institution standards on how we see information disclosure so that it is, it is impactful to development business. We have two categories of actors when we refer to ENS information disclosure. The first one being borrower and client. When I say borrower and client, I'm here considering sovereign entities, government that we are doing business with. We call them in our context in Africa, regional member countries. And when I refer to clients, I refer to private sector entities or financial intermediaries that are similar to private sector in their operating model. Our policies require these partners, borrower and clients, when we finance project and activities for their benefit, to ensure a meaningful participation of project stakeholders in the process. What do we call meaningful participation? It means that when these partners conduct their ENS assessment for decision-making on the operation to be financed, they must provide information as much as they can, available information on the risk and impact to all those who are interested in this operation. And when these documents are ready to be considered by the bank, these documents must be discussed with the communities whose geographical area will host the project or the activities to be financed, and who are likely to be exposed to any risk or impact or externalities, if I may put it in a generic word. Then there is a mandatory disclosure that is a requirement of our institution, which is that any operation considered to be moderate risk, ENS risk operation, as you know, MDBs and DFIs, when we finance operation, our risk categorization is based on some specific and technical criteria, and we end up with usually 3 types of risk classification: high risk project, moderate risk project, and low risk project or activities. So with AFDB, when you have a moderate risk project, we ask our partner to disclose the ENS information, ENS report, at least 30 days before we submit the project to our board for consideration. Private sector projects are required to disclose 60 days, and public sector projects that we call sovereign projects that are high risk, their documents must be disclosed at least 120 days prior to award date. And then after the project is considered as bankable and approved by our board, during the implementation phase, when the project is active, the borrower or client is required to inform permanently the public and communities that are surrounding the project area, and also to share any relevant information or incident report if it happens in the project context to the bank and the co-financer or any other international parties that are interested in the project. On our side, we do have commitment when it comes to ENS information disclosure. We disclose also within the same time frame all documentation shared with us by the client and the borrower via our website, and specifically via something that we call our integrated safeguard tracking system, which is a repository where we file and archive any information related to all the portfolio we are financing in Africa. And then, like what the borrower is required to do, we also, along the project life cycle, we disclose permanently any ENS-related information that either we collect by ourselves when we go on field mission, or what the borrower or client shared with us. This is the generic framework, with the FEPUC framework of AFDB when it comes to ENS information collection, gathering, processing, or disclosure to the public and operation stakeholders. The challenge is now coming to what we are experiencing in Africa in the COVID era. Yet we have to recognize that what we call environmental information system in Africa are very weak. And if we consider that ENS information system are one of the key piece of the ESG framework, then we will understand that in the context of COVID, things have been worsened because of the following reason. It is almost impossible for us currently to go to the field, to have real survey, discuss with population. I'm mentioning this specific aspect because quantitative data can be acquired using special technology like satellites, remote sensing tools, and all this kind of thing. But when it comes to qualitative data, where you need to be in the field, exchanging with people, be it employees that are working for a company or a contractor, or the communities that are exposed to environmental externalities, you cannot use the remote tools to do so. So the COVID situation has worsened this type of the collection and processing of this type of qualitative data. To add to that, in Africa, though many people have access to cell phone, we must recognize that the majority of stakeholders, I would say communities, are not that savvy technology, because they cannot afford it for some of them, or they have such a low literacy that they cannot be easily contacted and discussed with when it comes to information qualitative data collection remotely. And we have a, kind of broad challenge when we try to use the growing ICT, opportunity in Africa. The challenge is that electricity access is something that, it is really not helping for the use of internet and all these tools that are linked to internet and could be really instrumental if we are not able to go to the field because of COVID, and even before that in some area because of security issue. And the challenge is also related to the fact that acquisition and validation of new type of information to disclose is not easy. Let's take the example of the social responsibility data. When it comes to this specific right of employees that are working for companies in Africa, information is not easily accessible. They are not willing to talk to external people. And we see it when we go for implementation support mission on our projects. Contractors are not always keen to share information on how they treat their employees, what are their rights. Even sometimes pollution records are not really available, or they are not willing to share with us. So the ESG requirements when it comes to social responsibility or climate risk, climate change induced risk, are not easily collectible actually in Africa. And then the final one that I can mention here, based on experience we have working with our partners on the ground, is insufficient resourcing. I already mentioned the weakness of the National Environmental Information System, where they do exist, but in many countries, there is no formal information system, environmental information system. There is a lack of legislation because when it comes to information sharing, we do need proper and adequate regulation for even private sector to make this information release kind of mandatory. Otherwise, it is, as I said, it is not really something that people are comfortable sharing with either donors or NGOs, because precisely in our policies, as we know, the accountability is something that is key. It is critical to us. We have this requirement and we have this opportunity offered to third parties to come and complain about any negative externality that is happening within the context of a project we are financing. Pollution, degradation of land, child labor, gender-based violence. Therefore, any such related information that can leak to NGO, contractors and companies and even private sector, they are so cautious to not release information that could be interpreted in a way that will come back and haunt them. So regulation is key, and this is something that is, lacking in many African contexts. Although the extent, as I said, and modality of environmental information disclosure are not the same in countries and industries, ICT, I think, will be instrumental in Africa because overall it will improve really the survey of some specific environmental aspect like land degradation. Even water pollution can be monitored remotely currently with tools that are available. So this is an avenue, this is an opportunity, but it needs also to be funded by someone. As I was mentioning, resource is lacking when it's come to information, ENS information collection, processing, storage, and distribution. ICT also is an opportunity because we have kind of continuous ability to processing the huge volume of data, which was not there years ago. And finally, the standardization of format is something that is offered by ICT because to make information usable, user-friendly, and and put it in the appropriate format and language that is accessible to all decision makers, we need to speak the same language. We need to convene on how we formulate indicators. How do we see or define ENS risk, and all these kind of things that are related to credibility. Let me share with you based on that, quickly, the experience that is going on. There is an initiative that we are launching in EFDB currently that we call the ENS Performance Rating Initiative. Why do we start doing this? It is based on the same finding that information is not, available in many ways. Even statistics that are available sometimes are not really accurate for proper decision making, to not mention qualitative data that are subject to many biases when it comes to, making decision and investment decision or project impact evaluation. All these kind of need and objective need, they require accurate and relevant data before you avoid any risk. So we are trying currently to establish something that we call the Performance Rating Initiative, which will try to promote a kind of proactive and preventive focus for safeguard capacity. When I say safeguard, I mean ENS, including climate change safeguard. So we have already started discussing a concept and framework with some stakeholders, mainly the private sector people, which we will target as first cohort, because working with private sector people is easier. They have sometimes resources, and when they are committed, it goes fast. They will establish a very good environmental and social management system, which a performance tracking will be one of the piece. So we will work with them to reduce what we call information asymmetry. Information asymmetry is something that I already mentioned in other words, which is some people have information that they don't want to share. Some need this information for their critical decision making, but they don't have it and they don't know where to go. And who is performing very well in terms of, for example, social responsibility, who has, relevant database on pollution or land degradation or, stock of minerals, or all this kind of information we need to make decision in development arena and also to assess green development and sustainable development. So we will pull together all the capacity and opportunities that exist with private sector already operating in Africa, and some public institutions also that have databases and know how to process data and information and put on a platform that we will discuss the contents, templates, and formats. By doing so, we think that we will strengthen the environmental and social safeguard capacity for sustainable development in the continent. Thank you very much. And again, happy to have been here and share my thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Issa, for this very informative presentation about Africa Development Bank's practice. And also I heard from you bring us back to the reality, highlighting the challenges on the ground in terms of data and lack of policy regulations, and also the digital divide. And thank you for your recommendation. Now we have talked a lot about the ESG and as a tool for promoting responsible investment. I would have the pleasure to invite the next speaker, Dr. Michelle Zhou, Deputy Director General from Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, China, to talk about strengthening the social dimension of ESG management with lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. She's also a senior social development consultant to World Bank. Mei Xiang has been engaged in social development services with the World Bank for over 10 years and is involved in social risk management of more than 60 World Bank investment projects across China and some other countries. Before the World Bank, Dr. Zhou worked for UNDP as a program manager and for DFID project as a deputy team leader for 6 years in China. So Michelle, the floor is yours. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Grace, Dr. Wang of UNOSSC. It's a great honor for me to speak on behalf of an organization which is Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, which is based in Hong Kong, China. Thanks for this opportunity. I would like to talk about the social domain in ESG investing with some lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. I will cover this topic from the following 6 aspects. The first one is the striking trends of social domain in ESG and the surge in social bonds and ESG funds after the outbreak of COVID-19. And the third one is the shocking social impacts and lessons from COVID-19. And fourth one, I will cover key social disclosure standards and data providers. Who are the key data providers? And the fifth one, I will talk about the major issues and challenges in social pillar of ESG. And finally, I will make some recommendations on future measures for social elements of ESG investing. As we all know, the social domain of ESG explicitly ties to several SDGs, including SDG-1, SDG-2, SDG-3, 5, 8, 10, and 12. So that's why we want to talk about the social pillars of ESG. They are closely related to SDGs. Now let's look at the trends of social domain in ESG. After the COVID-19 outbreak, the pandemic has put the social domain at the center of risk management and mitigation of pandemic impacts. A lot of studies showing that more people are paying attention to the social elements after the lessons from this health crisis. And with the COVID-19, social bonds are surging, while the ESG funds also increase gradually. There are evidence shows that stronger ESG practice in a company would bring higher investment return and company value that customers and other partners would pay to their company value. And there is another trend that showing shareholder first is shifting towards a stakeholder engagement, stakeholder benefits. And employees are becoming more important than ever. especially people need to look after the employees' health, safety, and their well-being, social protection, etc. And work and workers, especially female workers, are heavily affected by digitalization and automation, especially during this COVID-19 era. A lot of work goes to digital form. Finally, a trend I want to mention is the supply chain. The supply chain is under major restructuring for resilience, for its continuity, and for its liability because of the emergent protectionism, nationalism, etc. Now, let's look at the surging social bonds, which are related to the sovereign ESG funds. The social bonds grows a lot in the last year. It becomes the most prominent of sustainable bonds. It jumped sevenfold to 147.7 billion in 2020. And all these funds goes to social projects to relieve the impact of the health crisis. And for example, IBRD of the World Bank issued a social bond which amounts to $8 billion US. And the EU also issued a social bond amounted to 17 billion euro last year. And according to JP Morgan's estimation, this year, there will be another 30% growth in global green, social, and sustainable related bonds. So, and the ESG ETFs, the funds, also grow dramatically. Last year, the increase rate was 223%. And geographically, Asia Pacific grows fastest. We can also learn a lot of lessons from it, from the social perspective. Negative impacts first include massive layoffs. According to ILO's estimation, 25 million workers were laid off because of the COVID-19 lockdown, social distancing, and other measures. And 40% of the work and tasks were transformed to digital forms. And outsourcing work becomes very popular, and many companies goes to digital labor platforms for flexible and temporary short-term workers. But according to some studies, findings, 50%, half of the online workers only earn less than $2 per hour, which is low paid. And another negative impact is the increase in vulnerability and inequalities in gender, racial, and ethnic groups, also increase in income and labor market inequalities. Certainly it's obvious to people that the supply chain also affected a lot. It also locked down the connection between suppliers, buyers, etc. So the critical lessons we can learn from this outbreak of COVID-19, employees matter, as we all recognize. And people need to think about the stakeholders inclusively, not just their shareholders. Stakeholders include employees, also investors, and some other groups of partners and suppliers, etc. And another lesson is to be alert to workplace inequality and vulnerability, to be careful about the discrimination and in gender, race, and ethnicity, and also pay attention to the forced and child labor. These are the lessons that we need to bear in mind. And also a lesson come from addressing the social digitalization. Digital economy brings a lot of digital labor platforms. In total, now there are active digital labor platforms of 777 globally. And these digital labor platforms provides temporary and flexible workers. Under this digital labor and short-term work, temporary work, then how to ensure decent work for this short-term work from home, flexibly and temporarily, while avoid the low paid and also avoid the missing of social protection. Certainly a lesson also comes from the supply chain weakness and risks, and the supply chain resilience needs to be strengthened. I have mentioned the stakeholders map, not only shareholders, also employees, investors, customers, partners, suppliers, government, local communities, and the society. We need to take all this into consideration. Now let's look at the key social disclosure standards and the key frameworks for social disclosure and the major data providers. Key social standards, which are widely and commonly used by many organizations and investors, they include employee relations, labor and working conditions, diversity and equal opportunity, non-discrimination, indigenous people and the community, local community and supplier social assessment, customer privacy, and involuntary resettlement and land acquisition. Here, we can clearly note that health and safety are highlighted. For the social framework, the commonly used one includes the Global Reporting Initiative. The major ESG rating and data providers include MSCI, Bloomberg, RepRisk, Moody, etc. Now, I would like to highlight two social standards we require by the World Bank ESF framework when a project or company needs to acquire land. Then sufficient compensation and timely payment, community support and consultation are all required. So these are the standards I would like to highlight. Let's look at the major issues and challenges in the social pillar of ESG. The major issues are in the lack of the following aspects: a lack of awareness of social elements to many, a lack of professionals and practitioners in many countries, a lack of a single coherent global ESG reporting and rating system, and a lack of mandatory compliance and senior oversight in a company and project context, and a lack of third-party verification and evaluation of the ESG report and the social data. The challenges exist in how to get unbiased and sufficient social data, and how to address the digitalization of work and services, and how to change towards the from voluntary compliance to compulsory compliance in an appropriate pace and manner to different contexts, and how to build up a trusted social data and social disclosure and objective rating. These are the challenges we face. Finally, I want to talk about some measures for social aspect in ESG investing. The first measure is to integrate ESG social criteria into business operations, investment process, and decision-making. Combine ESG strategy and program with risk management at corporate level, and also ensure internal control and senior oversight of ESG management. Manage suppliers, conduct annual or social assessment for product safety through their product life cycle, and adopt subsidy policies where possible for investors and employers to apply ESG standards. And where possible, unify localized country regulation in social domain while referring to international ESG frameworks and standards. Further measures include gradually shift from voluntary to mandatory implementation of ESG social disclosure framework as appropriate. Like Hong Kong Exchange and clearing company has already required all listed companies to submit ESG report annually. So some has already started, and then many more can come after this kind of requirement. Use modern technologies, AI, big data, etc., to collect and process data and keep data privacy. Many have already started using these technologies. And coordinate policies to regulate social disclosure and address new social issues which are related to digital economy and outsourcing labor, and manage the social risks. Develop a standardized and singular global ESG framework, including the social pillar, which are under preparation and action by many international actors. Finally, is to facilitate advocacy, capacity building, and monitoring of the social aspects in ESG management. Thank you very much. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mei Xiang. Thank you for your presentation, especially so comprehensively introduced the social dimension of ESG framework, which is often, I think, bearing less attention than the other dimensions of ESG, but is critically important for the achievement of sustainable development goals. Thank you very much. Thank you all for distinguished panelists. I'm so happy that today we can get together for this very important subject. You have all shared your insights, experience, and recommendations from policymaking, legal regulatory frameworks, and actual practice perspectives. The demand is high and the time is short. This is what I hear in common from you all. COVID-19 pandemic has reversed human development progress and make the task even more urgent for us to increase investment for SDGs, but also increase more responsible investment for SDGs. Some of the SDG sectors are underinvested, and there's a strong role investment can actually play to align the capital with SDG goals. There's a rising momentum of responsible investment in developing economies, and digitalization has the potential to enhance the utilization of the responsible investment frameworks and toolkits, including the quality of integrating ESG framework. We also hear from you many challenges on the ground. These include local conditions, data accessibility, lack of policy and regulatory framework, capacity, and also lack of truly ownership of multi-stakeholders. But also, not only at local level, there's also challenge globally as to how to ensure harmonized approach while recognizing the diversity in realities. Moving forward, you have put forward very important recommendations for all of us to think and to act on. These include nurturing a global ecosystem for responsible investment, engaging all stakeholders to jointly own and collectively engage in policies, regulations, and disclosure frameworks, including ESG integration. Secondly, promoting international policy dialogues to incorporate knowledge, experience, and realities of developing economies to promote more operationality of ESG frameworks. The third recommendation that I take note is really to continue strengthen knowledge sharing and capacity development for developing economies to better harmonize with international practice and also support innovations in this area. Lastly, to address the digital divide, in order to leverage the advantage of digital technology to facilitate sustainable and responsible investment, to facilitate frameworks such as ESG integration, and to facilitate data collection. There are many more recommendations, but I think action is important. I heard from you several concrete initiatives that each of your organizations and companies are pushing forward. As the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation, we try to work with multi-stakeholders to promote cooperation among developing countries and also engaging developed countries in a horizontal relationship through triangular partnership. Our approach focuses on 4 pillars: policy advocacy, system coordination, knowledge and capacity development, and demand-driven programs and trust funds. That way, we can work with partners to promote solidarity and cooperation and collective actions by partners across developing countries and developed countries to address the challenge today. So many of the initiatives the speakers shared today can find good synergy with the work and platforms we offer at UN Office for South-South Cooperation. These platforms, including, for example, a global coalition of think tank networks, South-South Global Thinkers, involving over 250 think tanks around the world to jointly advance research and thought leadership on topics of South-South cooperation and SDGs, including South-South investment, trade, and financing for SDGs. We also offer a digital platform, South-South Galaxy, where we can connect partners to share knowledge and match supply demand to co-create South-South cooperation initiatives. Very importantly, today's webinar is organized under another important initiative, the Global South-South Development Center. This is jointly initiated by UNOSSC and CICETE as a global network of centers of excellence, a network of do tanks to translate knowledge of South-South and South-South cooperation and sustainable development into concrete partnerships and actions. Also, through concrete actions and partnerships to translate practice and experiences into policymaking elements. We welcome you all to join us on these platforms and initiatives, and hopefully together we can advance South-South cooperation and financing for sustainable development. The discussion and outcome of today's webinar, as well as the upcoming 2 other sessions under the same series, will feed into a report on SDGs-aligned responsible investment and South-South cooperation. We welcome all speakers today to contribute research papers to this. In order for us to know how we can better support your learning, the development needs, and follow up, we invite you to also scan the QR code to complete a brief survey. So lastly, I would like to thank Finance Center for South-South Cooperation, who has supported not only this webinar series, but also the platforms I just mentioned, South-South Galaxy, South-South Global Thinkers, and CICETE as our very important partner in China for the great partnership, great effort, and invite you all to partner with each other to take into more actions for financing for sustainable development. I look forward to seeing you all in the next upcoming sessions. Thank you very much.